conference and produced by the Sound of Knowledge Incorporated.
Continuation of my talk. What happened is at Black Hat in Singapore, we had a panel that was supposed to be about sort of the future of security, and it wound up getting completely eaten by the full disclosure debate, with me and one other person holding down the side of, hey, this stuff is wrong, and everybody else in the room disagreeing with us, which was kind of fun. I don't know what's the right format for doing this. I'd kind of hoped to be able to assemble a panel of individuals, but it turns out that most of the folks who'd be presenting the opposite side are busy presenting the opposite side in other rooms right now. So the way I figured that I'd run this is we'll just run this as a free-form question and answer discussion. And if that's interesting to all of you, that's great. And if it's not interesting to all of you, we'll break early and go find something else to do. So that being said, there's a live mic on the chair over there. People who've got opinions that they wish to express can run, especially if you want to express it at length and loudly, run over and grab the mic. Otherwise, you can shout out comments, and I'll do my best to repeat them if they're repeatable, and we'll just take things from there. Yeah.
What is your opinion on active counterattacks, such as bouncing back package from service attacks, or malicious attackers who bounce back
That's a really interesting question, and actually, I'd love to see a show of hands from people in the room about that, and then maybe I'll give you some opinions. How many people in this room believe that it is acceptable if your site is brought under attack to reflect the attacking traffic back onto the attacker? 1, 2, 3, 4. And how many believe it is not? Okay, so that's one answer there. Now, I'm not saying that this is a democratic process, right? The mob does not necessarily rule. I know I'm very uncomfortable with it. How do you think you'll address the issue where somebody spoofs traffic claiming to come from you, and my security systems blow you away?
Well, it comes down to, and again, this is just my opinion. This is the very same thing if the junk mail. I mean, if everybody were to take their junk mail, they end up getting really close to stuff. Write a big red refused on it and put it back in the slot. Whoever's actually sending the mail back to get postage twice. Now, if somebody spoofs an IP address, then we're not talking about encrypting. We're talking about some very serious actions that raises concerns. So what it does, it also affects core systems.
What if you?
I do feel that it is. It would be an appropriate measure if you could take out the spoofing aspect.
How would you feel if I sent you a piece of bulk mail addressed from the president, and you returned it unopened, and later found out it had a bomb in it? That would suck.
Well, you're right. It would suck, but it wouldn't. I wouldn't be opening it anyway. It comes down to protecting my core systems.
Not when the Secret Service were beating you with a rubber hose, you wouldn't.
Well, you're right, but I mean, I'd much rather be beaten with a rubber hose than dead. It comes down to that point. Granted, if somebody is hit a company with a distributed DOS and is actually borrowing IP addresses from remote clones, then the system or the company that has those systems that are actually generating this traffic, they should, one, be aware of it, okay, or be informed of it, and two, is it really my responsibility to inform a company that they've been corrupted? All I'm trying to do is protect my systems. Now, what I can do as an alternative is just drop those packets and drop the information. But if it's just some bunch of kiddies or a bunch of people just trying to go in and hack and not in a very unsophisticated way, then I don't think it'd be too terribly wrong to give the giver. And again, that is just my opinion.
There are two trains of thought in dealing with people who wrong you. One of them would be typified by Malcolm X, which is we're going to take our guns and we're going to go rumble with them. And the other would be typified by Mahatma Gandhi, which is we're going to tolerate you and pray that you go away. And I have to say I come from the Gandhi school until the point where somebody has identified themselves as a sufficiently malicious character, in which case I switch over to Attila the Hun mode. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you for a minute about your opinion from a consumer's point of view. Imagine, if you would, a situation where we've moved into the counterterrorism model, and we've told companies, okay, instead of law enforcement, litigation, and it's going to be, we are going to become responsible and start reporting these attacks to the appropriate companies. I imagine a scenario where instead of individuals having individual security, we're now going to be relying on the companies that provide the connectivity to provide the security as well. And my fear there is a situation where the companies are going to become incredibly paranoid and very, very overly restrictive, more so than ever would be necessary to protect the networks. For instance, ISPs suddenly only allowing port access outbound on port 80, and that's it. And that's all you get for your X number of dollars a month.
Well, that's an interesting point. One of the things that happens if you, one part of my job is I work a lot with lawyers because, I have to. And when you ask a lawyer a question, their answer is essentially, if there's not a law saying that you can't do it, and there's not a law saying you should do it, then you shouldn't do it, because doing anything is more risky than not doing something. So I suspect if you were an ISP and you went to your lawyers and said, what we're going to do is we're going to restrict all traffic to our customers, so that the only thing you can do is outgoing port 80 and DNS, unless they have signed a waiver saying that they're accepting all liability for their packets. Their lawyers would be all over that and say that's a great idea, and in fact it would probably become mandatory within a very short period of time. Don't get me wrong, I'm really scared about getting lawyers involved in this situation. I think if we get lawyers involved, and that's the first step to getting the government involved, and that's just a bad thing for everybody. On the other hand, the current situation is completely out of control.
I guess the root of my question is, how do we balance the need for this more active vigilance in the community with the need to keep the internet an open environment?
Well, first off, I don't think that the internet needs to be an open environment. I'm a little radical about that. We won't go into that in any more detail, but the balancing issue there is always one of control. And historically, what happens, at least in our society, is if you prove that you can't control yourself, then Joe Average and the fun police will come along and say, okay, you can't control yourself, we're going to come along and control you for you. Teenagers, for example, used to be able to buy alcohol at an early age. We discovered that they couldn't control themselves, so the fun police came and took that right away. And there's a completely compelling case that could be made that you can't get unrestricted internet access until you're 18 and you've got a signature from your parents that they've put some restrictive software on your machine. Now, I don't want to see that happen. I just think it's going to happen if the situation doesn't get better really soon. Yeah.
The statement is that I think you're a little bit optimistic about the cover-up releasing to media companies, basically getting companies to clean up their act. If I went to the New York Times and said, hey, I can tap into portable phones and listen to them, and this knowledge has been out there for a while, and these phone companies haven't really fixed the problem, they haven't recalled the phones, I don't think there would be much of a news story there, even though some people with scanners can listen in on these conversations. And secondly, since we do have that situation where people with scanners can listen in on the conversations, it's at a fairly low amount of activity, and so there's not that huge uprising against it. What do you think is an acceptable level of script kiddie activity to the point where it won't cause an uprising?
You've made a really, really interesting and valuable point, okay? Because this is a known problem, and we as a society have decided okay, it's below the radar screen because there aren't enough people doing it. And to sort of extend that analogy, let us suppose that someone manufactured a product specifically designed to tap cellular communications. That person, I suspect, would be obliterated very quickly.
Right. It is, cellular communications become more and more business critical.
More and more? You mean they're not now?
Well, it's well with the new handheld devices and web and with your basically integrating any kind of your mobile commuting with your telephone. It's having a scanner and listening in on someone's conversation is not nearly as dangerous from a business standpoint as somebody sitting there sniffing packets what you receive and looking at your confidential business agendas. And I'm not saying that it's not an issue. I'm just saying that from a business standpoint, having something in writing typically is much more valuable than having something, even in an electronic format, than having a voice conversation.
Which would you rather monitor, Bill Gates' cell phone or Bill Gates' email?
Oh, obviously a cell phone. Okay,
You can make a lot of money that way.
Right, but then again, Bill Gates isn't in a business to where he's sending back and forth valuable marketing information, and exactly. And so it's not so much like we're talking about release dates. We're talking about marketing information, time schedules. I mean, you're talking about all kinds of business confidential information that will soon be sent across these mobile computing devices. And I mean, right now, scanners, yes, they're our problem. However, as soon as the tools become available that anybody can, any script kiddie can go down and download a new patch to monitor somebody's email that they're receiving over their mobile phones, then I guarantee something will happen. That's because right. Enough of the business, enough of the money will be behind it.
What happens is when you hurt enough Joe Average, you get crushed. Let me be completely clear to all of you in this room. I have a hidden agenda, and I'll even expose it because that's the right thing to do. Okay, in American society, when we're dealing with a difficult problem, what we tend to do, because basically I think Americans are, as a society, fairly sane people, we tend to hang sort of in the political center of the issue. On some issues, the issue has been deliberately radicalized to the margins such that you can no longer be comfortable in the center. The examples would be the gun debate and the abortion debate. What I am trying to do, and will be trying to do for probably the remainder of my professional career, is to radicalize the debate on hacking, because I believe we're not going to make progress on this issue until we draw some hard lines and say you're either a good guy or a bad guy. The situation now is that the vast majority of people are completely comfortable saying, you're sort of an in-the-middle guy, and I just want to radicalize it some. This gentleman over here had his hand up.
I agree with most of what you said in the other meeting. One of the things that I did find an advantage to full disclosure, and I'm a little bit worried about if we go back to a mode where we don't have it, is with full disclosure, the security professionals actually get some of the information usually as fast as a lot of the script kiddies or whatever are starting to exploit it. I remember the days back when like the freakers and stuff were using the underground BBSs, and they basically you didn't find out what was going on with your system until your Merlin PBX had been completely hacked and you had all these long distance calls that had happened. You didn't figure it out until like 30 days later, and then you really didn't even know what had happened or what the fix was. But if that kind of stuff was publicized at the same time, which is kind of what's starting to happen now, or what's been happening over the last couple months, then those people know, wow, this vulnerability exists. Here's a couple things I can do to mitigate it because there's a discussion about it and things are happening.
When I talk about counterterrorism, one of the things that I'm basically preaching is switching over to unrestricted information warfare on the hacker community. And classic things that you do in a military intelligence or counterterrorist environment is infiltrate. And I think that part of the commitment that the good guys would have to make as part of that effort would be setting up bulletin board systems that were in fact undercover operations for information gleaning. We could, no offense to...
But how would that information get back out into the public so that Joe Average would know to protect his system?
It would filter its way back out. I mean, this is basic intelligence operations 101. Let's say we had 1,000 security professionals, all of whom had, the correct secret handshake so that we could identify each other, but the bad guys couldn't. Now, of course, the bad guys could counter-infiltrate us, and that's where the whole game gets kind of interesting. But and this also happens in terrorism, counterterrorism, drug dealing, and counter-drug dealing. But if you had a sufficient number of professionals who were engaged in counter-information gathering, they would be able to leak that information into the good side. In other words, if the bad guys didn't know whether they were talking to a Fed or to one of their cohorts, it would reduce their ability to communicate among each other, and it would greatly increase the chance that the good guys would find out about it. Yeah, Mudge. Sorry. That seemed to trigger something there.
Oh yeah, no, of course. The large grouping of computer security professionals that would be the central repository sounds reminiscent of CERT, and we saw how wonderfully well that one worked in disseminating information.
He scored a direct hit there.
A second thing, and I have to bring it up. I've got to play. You're playing devil's advocate, so I've got to do the same thing. Releasing tools in the script kiddie type venue and nature. And you mentioned you're either, let's play it one side or the other. You're either a good guy or you're a bad guy. For somebody who, let's put a imaginary character who releases a tool that enables you to promiscuously monitor all email traffic, all network traffic patterns, passwords. Basically, could be turned into Carnivore++ quite easily, and has also released other tools to hide their tracks on Unix systems to maybe get away playing, without having to pay billing or school accounting times. Is that person a good guy or a bad guy?
Well, that's one of the problems with any kind of tool. I would say the person probably has to have an answer to that question, and it's appropriate to ask it in a public environment. There are a lot of tools out there. This is the fundamental issue in the tools debate. There are tools that can be used in two different directions. I think that the thing that needs to be looked at is what is the majority of the way that the tool is used in operational deployment. If you have a traffic analysis engine and it is mostly being used for intrusion detection, you probably say it's okay, but if it's mostly being used for password capture, then you would call it a password capture tool. And again, the gun debate is, as much as I hate getting into that whole steaming kettle of dog mess. It's a great analogy, right? As a society, some people seem to have decided that assault rifles are evil while bolt-action hunting rifles are not. Why? It's because of the attitude and the deployment and stuff like that. And I think what's going to happen is that tools are going to fall under those same kind of analyses. I think honestly, if somebody were to release a tool like, let's say, Back Orifice and sell it as a systems management tool, and hackers started using it, that would be one thing. If somebody promotes it as an attack tool and then subsequently tries to put a gloss of system management varnish on it, then that's going to probably, you've cast the dialogue on that tool in an interesting way.
You've taken Media Training 101. You didn't answer the question, though. Are you a good guy or a bad guy?
I'd say I'm a good guy. I'd say I'm a good guy. And, that's, well. Okay, so I failed. Actually, I haven't taken media training. This gentleman over here, can get the mic over to him.
That was a great segue there. The issue I was going to bring up and question you on your earlier assertion about tool writers people are going to come down on them, those are going to go away, and you'd be silly to sign your work. I was thinking the gun analogy is the perfect one there. No one has come to the handgun specifically is a good one. It has pretty much one obvious purpose, to shoot people. You can make some other arguments for rifles, for hunting, but a handgun, now why you're shooting people, for defense or offense can be argued, but the tool itself has a pretty obvious function.
You ever heard of Olympic pistol target shooting? Anyway.
Oh, yeah. No, you can certainly do that recreationally, but the primary function of the tool, there's an example in real world, I think, where the tool's primary function might not be for the best, for the highest common good, but people don't come down, and there's a polarized debate on the issue, but they don't come down on the gun makers and say, you're going to stop making guns, or we're going to sue you for making guns.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. In Maryland, for example, gun makers there are all kinds of restrictions on gun makers. Gun makers, if you transfer guns anywhere in the U.S., if you're a gun maker, you are regulated like you can't possibly believe. And that's what I'd like to see happen to the security tools makers.
Okay. Sorry, I misspoke. They are regulated. I was taking the analogy you said of the tools would not be made. Regulating the making of tools is different from what you were saying before. And that was what
Indeed, there was a massive series of lawsuits against the gun industry for damages by several states' attorneys generals, claiming that by selling guns into their district, Smith & Wesson and other had essentially cost them tremendous amounts of damage in dealing with it.
What was the end result of those trials?
It's still dragging on. Lawyers are getting... The end result was a bunch of lawyers got rich.
Yes, and so in that extent, I think you're absolutely correct as far as the tools. There will be lawsuits. I just question the end result of your point of
Right.
the tools will actually go away.
Well, there is a danger to releasing tools, and I think it's going to happen. I mean, Mudge kind of twitted me on the issue of cloak.c, which I wrote when I was an undergrad because we had a no games playing policy on our Unix machines, and I like to play Rogue. Arguably, I'm an ex-Black Hat. Well, that's the closest I've ever come to violating system security. The tool makers today, I mean, I just don't understand. They mustn't be talking to their legal counsel, because producing something that is designed solely to take down other people's networks and releasing it, I would think that you're incurring a substantial risk for getting zapped down the road. Cool. Hey, Joel. You want to talk about the other side? Yeah. Okay. Actually, does anybody else wish to join us up here as panelists? Mudge, would you like to come on up, Mudge? I don't want anyone to think that I'm hogging the microphone here, but some of the people didn't make it until a little bit later. Let's see, who had their hand up? How about Lou? There.
Oh, no, I'm not on his side. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure.
I think there's a historical parallel, and I'd like you to explore it. When this country was founded, there was this kind of procession westward. And in that procession, there was a search for some kind of order, law and order. And there wasn't a lot of law and order. In order to develop order, the country went to vigilantes. And in the vigilante movement, there were excesses, often wretched excesses, which in turn triggered the development of other vigilante groups to silence those. Now, part of what I'm wondering is, in your call for unrestricted warfare, is there some potential for vigilantism?
Well, I'd say there absolutely is. What do you guys think?
Well, the strike back stuff was kind of popular, about 6-8 months ago, and has been. Who had the firewall?
Sidewinder.
Sidewinder, right? And I think it's kind of, in my view of things, has been roundly sort of, put on the fringe as something that people don't want to engage in. I mean, we should try to combat these things, but I don't know if counterterrorism is the best way to go about it either. So I think I tend to agree.
Yeah, speaking to the mic.
Is this on?
Okay. How much? Oh, okay. The other gentleman on my panel, this is Joel Scambray. He's one of the gentlemen who teaches the extreme hacking class that I was dissing earlier. And the other gentleman here is my good friend Mudge, who is from the Loft. Dr. Mudge. I don't even really... Now at stake, who has produced some of the tools that I was dissing on earlier.
I also have co-authored one of those how to hack manuals called Hacking Exposed.
He's a mayhem manual writer.
So I'm to the left of Marcus, or to the right. I'm not sure, but
well, that's the whole issue here. I'm trying to polarize the dialogue so we can at least say what is good and what is bad, and then we can work it out from there.
I've got a different solution for the vigilantism and the attack backs, which is, I believe that all of the here we go, all of the large organizations out there should be engaged in their own war college activities. What I really believe should be happening is everything that has been said so far, and I will be extremely surprised if I go through this conference and I don't see everybody in reactionary mode or reacting to particular things. And nobody is sitting there going, my organization is going to deploy XYZ technology, and damn it, I'm going to rip this thing apart, I'm going to find the new attacks, I'm going to design them, I'm going to build threat models around it, and that's the only way I'm going to understand how to prevent against these future attacks that are coming out down the road. You know, the classic line of, and I think it was Churchill, and he had so many great ones, if not, you know, we'll attribute another one to him, you know, the worst case scenario should never come as a surprise. And if you sit there and you set up a Sting bulletin board system or a Sting website because you're just trying to suck off information that other people have already done this sort of research on, and you're already behind the times, you're already in a defensive stance. What you need to be doing is figuring out where these new attacks are going to be coming from on your own based upon how you're using the technology, what weaknesses, what stress points you're introducing. And sure, sometimes you have to test that, and you will have to design these tools, and you will have offensive tools that you have created because of this. But it's the only way that you can actually buttress up and buffer up your defenses beforehand.
Yeah, let's get the mic to this. Let's get the mic to this gentleman here who's been patiently waiting. Oh, he's got it already. Magic. Go ahead.
Just happen to be here. Earlier you had mentioned that you wanted to see tool makers licensed or regulated in some form. I'm wondering if you're envisioning a day when security professionals are going to need to be licensed. We're going to have to validate ourselves in some way in order to possess the tools. And is it going to become a case of own a script, go to jail? And let me just ask a follow-up question as well, which is, what happens to the people who aren't strict security professionals? For example, systems administrators. Are we going to say TCP dump is now an illegal tool that has to be regulated? Are we going to go to the level of system calls? I mean, how do we define who gets regulated, and how do we define what gets regulated?
As long as you sign your ActiveX controls, they're secure.
Oh, man. This is very similar to locksmithing and lockpicks, and basically there are some rules in certain places and not rules in others, because it is a tool in and of itself, but you have an intent component to it. Loftcrack was recently involved in a court case, I believe in California, and it was labeled as, in this particular case, a tool used in aiding to breaking into a particular system, which works really well by having these tools out here, because that is how they were able to layer on many more charges and allegations against this person. Because what are they going to do otherwise? Well, he got a password. Well, no, they charged him with owning breaking and entering tools with the intent to use. Now, if he didn't have the intent to use, they're not breaking and entering tools. So if you license and only have these tools, you are instantly defining them as nothing but malicious in anybody else's hands. And you're taking away any beneficial use, I think, or altruistic uses that you might have given in a wild or natural environment.
I agree with you, but if you talk with law enforcement officials, you'll find that when they arrest someone for breaking and entering, damn near anything they have gets listed as B&E tools. Yeah. A screwdriver gets listed. I mean,
well, but there's perfectly reasonable reasons behind that. Okay, if I'm busted by a cop and I'm carrying a piece of metal, that's one thing. If I'm carrying a piece of metal that's been ground to a sharp point, happens to be covered with blood, and there's a guy lying over there with a hole in his kidney, that's an entirely different matter. If I'm busted with a copy of Loftcrack and I'm Mudge and I wrote it and I'm not releasing it, or if I'm busted by or if I'm busted with a copy of Loftcrack and 50,000 passwords that I've gleaned, those are two completely different issues. We've got the legal constructs for dealing with all of these things already. I just want to open the debate on where and how.
Certainly, but what we don't have right now is the ability to accurately identify the sources of the attacks. So what happens, using your mail example, with packets? Somebody sends packets, looks like it came from you. They investigate you, they find you have certain tools. Bang, you're busted for possession of those tools, but it wasn't you who perpetrated the attack.
I just want to say I get really nervous when discussions of intent come up, because proving intent is like saying, I know what you're thinking.
I'll give you your father's answer to that, which is, if you've got stuff that you're afraid someone's going to pin on you for carrying, don't have it.
Well, okay, so I got to give back my Daisy BB rifle, and Dad.
And my conscience.
And my conscience. I think that, let's talk about possession of drugs with intent to sell. So if you have 50 copies of Loftcrack, you're in trouble, but if you have one, you're not. I don't know.
By the way, Loftcrack 3.0 is coming out in about 2 days, so.
All right.
That's intent to distribute.
Let's take a question from over here. You. Yes, you. Yes, you with the hat. Oh, sorry.
There, that's better.
It's being recorded for posterity.
I'll keep it G-rated. As far as the gun analogy, which seems to have something to do with network security, I would suggest that the assault rifle is a rapid-fire delivery of slugs, and a bolt-action rifle is a slower delivery of slugs. Therefore, if you run Nmap and you port scan someone very quickly, that's bad. But if you port scan them by making individual connections one at a time and letting them time out, that's okay. I'm not sure I really follow that thinking, but I didn't want to go there. What I did want to say, I'm a little surprised at the nature of this discussion going into all this technical stuff, because I've got a page with over 3,000 Class Cs of Telnet connections. And is Doug Sung in here? Too bad. When Doug was at Usenix, Doug sniffed the wireless network at Usenix and found all kinds of wonderful user password combinations. And Usenix, for those of you who don't know, is attended by some fairly intelligent people. So my thinking here with respect to the tools is, it seems to me the tools discussion, you know, for those of us who are technical enough to appreciate the minutiae of whether or not certain tools are good and the intent and all that is a great thing, but we still have people using Telnet. We still have clear text passwords going out there.
Let me get this right for the record. You're blaming the victim?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we really might want to address that in this discussion.
I raped her because she was dressed like a slut. I sniffed his packets because he wasn't using encryption. That is not a valid argument, sir.
And I'm afraid I don't agree with that as a valid extrapolation, but if you want to go that way, that's fine. I don't consider that valid. The computer security community and the internet is wide open. Bomb making and prawn notwithstanding, it's there. I don't think a lot of us would be working if it wasn't for the user community and their lack of attention to these sort of things. As tool makers, isn't it our responsibility to address those things that we already know? I mean, to go back to your analogy of your father, if you're afraid that you're going to get raped, don't dress that way.
If you're afraid you're going to get raped, carry a 44. Did you guys have let's take some comments from the other panelists.
No?
That one's really kind of a touchy issue.
Well, no, it's
If your car got stolen, keys were in it.
yes, it's a liability issue. Exactly. If you're a bank, let's put it on the victim, you know, because of course the bank wants the customer to end up. They want to always pass the buck and have the victim be somebody. Everybody wants the victim to be somebody other than yourself. The bank gets robbed. And the underwriters come in and say, well, all the money that they stole, where did you store it? Did you store it in the in the vault? And they said, no. Well, we left it out on the on the front porch here. Well, we're not going to underwrite your loss then. So I mean, it is up to some people to do a level of due diligence. And if you don't do that due diligence and you have the mechanisms in place, if I walk around, dressed like a slut.
But you do. No, seriously. One of the points I tried to make, maybe I didn't hammer on it enough in my keynote, is we need to raise the level of accountability across the board. Yes, if I am so stupid that I don't secure my website, somebody should come along and say, you idiot, you should have fixed that. There are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people out there that need a good slap in the back of the head saying, dork, fix your site. On the other hand, the way to show those people they've got a problem is not to hurt them.
Well, I'd like to agree with what you said with one caveat, and that is your own point. I think that the responsibility is to bring the vulnerabilities to the attention of the person who is the potential victim before. I think it's a contextual issue. Yeah. It's, absolutely, it's not a justification to go around raping Mudge because he's dressed like a slut, okay? It's more a justification and a responsibility, sorry Mudgy, for us to inform the not necessarily stupid, but perhaps naive, perhaps inexperienced, perhaps uninformed community, hey, this is a potential liability, you ought to address it before it goes from being a potential liability to reactionary panic.
Well, this is happening. Let me see a show of hands. How many of you believe that there is an ethical lapse in the ISP that is selling DSL connections to the thousands of Joe average customers who don't understand security and not telling the customer that there's a potential liability on the customer's hands? Only raise one hand.
Wait.
Okay.
So do you think
How many?
ISP is liable?
How many think?
Not telling them
No, not liable. Okay, there's what's right and wrong, and that's ethics, and then there's what's legal, and that's law, and that's decided by lawyers. Liability. How many people think that the ISPs have a moral duty to warn their customers? If you do this, you're leaving yourself vulnerable.
Second question. How many people out there, show of hands, think the ISPs are aware or even are bright enough to realize that they're doing anything wrong here?
Maybe
That's the
half,
minority
yeah.
all of a sudden. Some are. Are they the majority?
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Who gets the... Yeah, around the fourth page of the disclaimer. Okay, let's get the mic.
Well,
okay. Another question?
no, I'm gonna hand.
Okay, let's see. You can get it. Gets to this gentleman. Hang on.
One point I'd like to make.
Hang on.
is that
Only one person
vulnerabilities-
talks at once, or this doesn't work.
Now?
Yeah.
No, one point I'd like to make is that vulnerabilities are never disclosed as just vulnerabilities. What happens is they're disclosed as either a vulnerability and here's the exploit, or there's a vulnerability and here's the defense. And to me, that is the defining issue. Whether it's identified as with an exploit or a defense, that tells you whether it's black or white.
Can I?
Good point. It's back to the intentionality issue.
I want to address this with just a real recent anecdote with this Outlook buffer overflow in the date field. USSR Labs acted responsibly in that situation. Does anybody disagree with that? They posted an exploit, but they waited for Microsoft to issue a fix. Now, somebody else posted a bug track in the interim, so that's a different story. But I don't see things getting worse.
Okay, well, now we're going to get into a debate with our own panel, because did they have a basis to believe that all the users out there had upgraded their software and that they were not putting anyone at risk when they released that exploit?
Well, I personally am motivated to get fixes by the extent of the risk involved, and to some degree, illustrating that risk is important in motivating people to get the patch.
You're not only just illustrating it, you're raising it. You're raising the risk.
Well, I mean, they pop up a window that brings down their website. I mean,
I think it's interesting because when you release an exploit, you're raising the risk that it's going to be used.
I'll join in over here on the left wing to the
How are we gonna
liberals versus the reactionaries. Sorry. I think you're making a fatal flaw in that you're presupposing you understand everybody's environment and their means for protecting or their means of understanding a particular problem. The way that we had an evolutionary life cycle over at the Loft on how we actually released advisories. At the very beginning, we went directly to the vendors and nobody else but the vendors. And the vendors basically told us to, if their clients didn't know about it, we should shut the hell up because they're going to have to spend more money to fix it, and why should they do that? Because they're being profitable here. So at that point, we went to their customers and said, this is how this really works. If you see this as a problem, you need to let the vendor know because they're unwilling to do the right thing on their own. So we started doing that, and that was, and there were certain vendors that earned the position where things would be released at the same time that the vendors were being told because they had trained us by responding when they were told beforehand that this was the only way it would be addressed. Now that Microsoft actually has a security organization, now that Intel, we just created Intel's security group by doing the iPivot advisory. The iPivot is their crypto accelerator box. They had no security reporting mechanism, no way of handling these things. And if it hadn't been for the fact that we went to them, gave them advance notice, gave them an exploit because they couldn't figure out how to do it, and also, what was it? It was a back door that they had put in there. And they were saying, here's the binary patch for all of our customers. Guess what? The customers don't trust them now because it's a back door, and they need proof of concept so they can see that the thing is fixed on their own. Independent third-party review that has to provide the tools.
And I want to reinforce the worst-case scenario comment, which is, okay, let's say that USSR Labs didn't release an exploit and didn't release an advisory. Sorry. And Microsoft released this innocuous little patch for an Outlook date date field fix.
Well,
would anybody go grab it and download it right away? Yeah. I mean, personally, I'm not motivated to go get this stuff.
Let me just finish up on how the actual, I didn't want to leave the dangling of this being videotaped for whatever to be used against me later in a court of law.
My goons are outside the door.
Yeah, with the security advisories, the finalization of that evolution is now there is a defined policy where the vendors are worked with, but it still goes out. And if an advisory comes out slanted towards malicious use, and it doesn't mean whether it has a proof of concept code or not, or a fix, because we try and make sure that if it's gratuitous exploit code, it doesn't go in. But if it's not gratuitous, it goes in and there's always a fix. So now you got both of them. How do you label that? It's all in. If you're the first person, if you were the War College and you were doing this analysis, you control the information you're giving out. Hence, you can put the spin on it. And if you put the spin on it, that largely dictates whether it's going to be used for malicious or beneficial purposes.
Disclosure in this particular example of the Outlook buffer overflow and USSR releasing the exploit at the same time that Microsoft releases the patch. It's just that. It's at the same time. So by USSR Web releasing the exploit at the same time they're releasing the patch, they're not giving Microsoft customers appropriate response time to be able to download the patch and install it at the same time that the exploit is being released for script kiddies or other hackers to be able to exploit that patch.
So what's the right time? 5 minutes later? 2
About a
weeks
year.
later?
About a year. Look, my point is if you're doing something and it causes someone else to get hurt, you're doing something wrong. The lady down there is the mic.
I had a couple of questions. Basically, I want to regress on something that Mudge said when he started talking about people getting their systems and actually having to take it apart, learn it, find out what's wrong with it, and find fixes for the holes. That's making... I understand what you're saying, and I agree with it totally, but it's slightly begging the question, and it's assuming a theory that's incorrect. You're thinking that the user can actually do that. There are a lot of users out there who are totally ignorant, and we're having to deal with those. They don't know anything about those machines. Some of them don't even know how to turn on those machines. They're there doing the 9 to 5, just trying to make a living. And we have to find ways to make those machines safe when they're using them. That makes our job a little bit more difficult. We can't say, okay, you just got a system, figure out what's wrong with it, and fix it.
No, I agree with you. I think what happened is you potentially mistook who I was addressing. I don't want the end users to do this. I want the large companies to do this. I want AT&T. I want Microsoft. I want Nortel. I want Sun to have internal war colleges. I want when people sit there and get hit with this distributed denial of service attack, and I'm sitting there at the White House with the president, and Charles Wong of Computer Associates says, well, Mr. President, are you going to impose liability on us for this, since we were basically all of the people were aware it's an old problem? He says, no, you guys need to police yourself. They said, fine, no problem, we didn't lose any money, nobody lost any money, go away.
Okay, I understand what you're saying.
Those sorts of corporations should have been able to publish the information, should have been able to address this before it actually happened. I think if you try and educate every end user in the world, that's a scalability problem that you're never going to win. But if you start designing things, your only chance to win is when you get into the design stage. Tactically, it's the scaling problem.
Exactly, but at that point, you've just proved what Marcus was saying earlier, in that you have to go through the proper engineering, you have to look at the security side of it, you have to look at the companies. Number one, you're assuming that all the people in those companies are intelligent, and number two, you're assuming that the United States President is intelligent. When I worked with him as a governor, that wasn't the case.
No, we're not.
As a matter of fact, when he was the governor, he was one of the ones we were showing how to turn on the computer.
I don't expect him to be remediating systems or designing, the secure strategy on the bit and byte level. Now, another thing that this is something that's just so internalized to me, I probably don't do a wonderful job of articulating it. When I say designing a system, if you're an ASP, it's not that you're Sun Microsystems and you have to do this just for Solaris. You do this for any of your infrastructure. When you're growing a company and you're starting to I've got this huge mega pipe going out, I'm doing this sort of traffic analysis. I've got OC48s that I'm doing whatever modeling on. I'm an ASP and I've got all this back-end equipment. You look at the interactions of what you're going to happen, because that's where all the stress points are. it's when I get product X to interact with product Y, and I want to theorize all those attacks. There's a lock picking, or I should say, there's a locksmith convention going on right now. It's one of the larger ones in the United States, and this is very interesting. I sat on the plane next to a guy who was giving a presentation there. On the way down, he said, "Oh yeah, well these the simplex locks are quite neat. They're a novel solution for keyless entry," and they hadn't thought about the different attack vectors here. They didn't think of the threat problem. Sure, you don't have the pins to pick it anymore, and if they would have thought about this, they would have said, what's the total key space? I can only reuse these numbers once. Boom, I can go through the entire thing in 10 minutes. How do I figure out what the numbers were? Can I walk over with a number 2 pencil and use the eraser and leave little trails on them, so when somebody pushes them, I now know what the combination was when I go back over. If you think of these threat models beforehand, you can prevent them before they actually happen. That's not for the end user who installed the simplex lock to be responsible for figuring that out and defending themselves. That's the people who are like designing the simplex lock, or the people who are the integrators or the installers that are supposed to be masters of this particular technology for your secure environment.
I agree with that, but the problem with that is it's not the companies that are suffering the consequences. It's the end users. And until we find a way to make the companies suffer the consequences and make them pay the bill when the end users suffer, it's not going to make any difference.
That's the flip side of the blame the victim argument, though. The victim is too stupid, and therefore they're doomed.
Not stupid, ignorant.
No.
There's a difference.
No, she's not blaming the victim. She's taking the role of the victim. She's saying, hey, it's wrong. You're hurting people.
Everybody drives a car on a road. Everybody has a phone connected to a phone network. If you get a call from a telemarketer and you spend your life savings buying a bridge in Brooklyn somewhere, can you sue somebody for that?
Fraud, yes.
Yes.
Yes, you can. Yep.
Absolutely, you certainly can.
Let's get the mic to this guy here who's been patiently waiting for a while.
And while it's being handed over,
What I'm saying is that there are companies putting out products that are not our products. They're not suffering. The people that suffer.
I agree with you. So now let's look at the threat model. How do you convince these companies to actually do the right thing? Because they're not the ones that are suffering. They're not the ones losing the money. Well, you instantly take the security, and this is a little paradigm shift. It used to be that security was the cost center. If you go to like the IT security group or putting security in a product, they say this is going to cost us a lot of money, and what's our return on investment? The customer is going to buy it whether we do it or we don't do it. So screw the customer, right? That's basically what you're saying, because they're not the ones. The company's not the ones being hurt. Well, if you can look at it and say, if you put security in at the strategic level, we're going to enable you to conduct a new business in a way that you weren't able to do before. Now you've turned security from being a cost center into a quantifiable and qualified return on investment. And that's how you have to pitch it into these companies to get them to do the right thing for the end user. It's a different approach method, and I think that's one of the ways that might work.
Well, let's take the gentleman here. Thread change.
Okay, I know I'm going to get lynched for dragging us off this topic here. I want to return to what I say is one of the more core issues here, which is raising awareness, getting Joe Average to the point of being annoyed where something happens. And I think that exploit code has been seen as a tool to do that. But there's potentially a different tool which would be equally valid. And to borrow some terminology from Marcus's earlier talk, that's detection logic. That's sending out some kind of test which is harmless, but would still indicate that there is a problem. Now the problem, of course, is technically how do we make something that's harmless that can't be reverse engineered and turned into exploit code?
Right. I mean, if you sent everybody a piece of email saying, if this is working on your browser, go to this site to download a new copy because you're in deep doo-doo right now. That's perfect.
And that's the 0 day. That's the 0 day argument again. So you're vulnerable. You should get this patch. And we're not going to tell you how it's exploited for a year.
That's right. Right. The whole thing that totally smokes me, though, is that end users who really, let's have a moment of pity for the end users. They're not sophisticated enough to do anything about this, yet they're the ones who are taking the brunt of the damage.
Marcus.
Oh, yes. This admin's no hell. The gentleman there in the checkered shirt.
I
want to take this discussion a different direction here and go back to something you mentioned in your keynote speech, and that relates to open source code and having script kiddies and others get towards being a more productive, dare I say it, member of society, and the defense against that, one of the defenses or the tools that you mentioned being civil litigation against them. Let's take an open source application such as Linux, where we have many different individuals participating in the development of such an open source application. How are we as users, or even corporate users, going to be able to protect ourselves with civil litigation when we may not even know who the author of that piece of code is that's affecting us? And there are several people who are willing to come forward, such as Munge and other people who have come up with ways of hacking into that, but then there's many others who are staying hidden behind the scenes, behind the curtains. How do we go after those people, or what's our defense against those people when we don't even know who they are?
Well, that's where, when you get into a counterterrorism model, you have to aggressively go out and find those people. I'm completely in agreement, and then I'll turn the mic over to Mudge. I'm completely in agreement with his idea that large corporations need to have war colleges. I don't have the staffing and the funding, but if I did, I'd have people out there trolling the bulletin boards, pretending to be elite hackers, and if anybody found out about a vulnerability in my stuff, two things would happen. If I found out they were going to release an exploit. One, if they didn't contact me first, there'd be an army of lawyers waiting on their doorstep the next morning. Two, if they did contact me, the bug would get fixed immediately. Customers would be notified, but they wouldn't be told what the bug was or how it worked. Simply, there was a security flaw in our product. We have now upgraded it. You will install this upgrade. It is mandatory, right? And what?
And if you don't?
And if you don't, there's nothing I can do about that at that point. But you tell somebody you've got to make this stuff.
Well, at that point, if the user decides not to do the upgrade, you're releasing liability for your security flaw and any action that someone may take against that security flaw at that point. So it's really a victim, a victim beware type of situation. Back to the responsibility discussion, there has to be responsibility on both parts, the corporations and the victims, as far as these security flaws go.
But there are legal constructs that accept all of this. If I sell you a car that has a perfectly functioning personal safety system in the form of a seatbelt and you tie it around your neck and hit a tree, it's not my fault. If you don't wear it, it's not my fault. If it explodes and decapitates your child, it is my fault.
If you didn't look at the car as a car manufacturer in the first place and figure out that you needed a seatbelt in there, or had the Ralph Naders that were pointing out by being the War College doing the analysis on the cars that it is your fault.
But this is a great analogy, because the Ralph Naders did not go around causing tens of thousands of car accidents to prove the need for seatbelts.
Right, which is exactly the War College analogy, and I think you missed the point on the War College, because you instantly said I would have a War College and we'd be sitting there trolling the bulletin board systems, waiting for other people to do the research work. You're in reactionary mode. If you had a War College in your large organization, you would be attacking your own product, trying to figure out where the stress points are, and you would actually be able to preempt these people from finding it and notify your customers before these other things came out and have a better product for them.
And you do tell people when you do tell people if they don't wear the seatbelt what the risk and what the threat is. If you just say, "Hey, stupid, put the seatbelt on," I'm not going to tell you why because it's too scary. Then you're not giving people the information they need to manage risk.
For children in the front seat?
Hang on. He's got the mic.
So if on one hand you tell your web administrator, you smack him in the head because he was too stupid to know what all the threats were to make sure his system was safe. But on the other hand, you've got to give that person the information about the threats, the information so they can do their own risk management. And if you don't give them the information about what these issues really are, how do you expect somebody to be able to effectively manage risks in their organization? It's just not possible.
Right.
So on the one hand, people need information to be able to manage risk in their organization. And it's one thing if you've got a PC and you need to decide if you want to install some software, but if you're an organization with 50,000 PCs and you now have to distribute this software all throughout your organization and you've got 100 of these patches on different platforms, you really need to know what the risk level is of each different threat so you can figure out what are the priority issues to deal with. So how
even have to really
Yes.
Exactly. So the question is, what I would like to do is get some advice from you. On the one hand, if full disclosure is bad, where you shouldn't give all the information to everybody on the planet, how is it possible to give the important information to the people who need it without making it available to everybody else? What's the solution?
All right. Windows needs to come with one of those little warning labels saying the Surgeon General has determined that using this product may cause you to be hacked. If you don't, whenever a little pop-up comes up and says download this new stuff, you better take it seriously.
But I don't understand what that has to do with anything. Without how do you give the information to people who need to manage risk without making it available to other people? What's the solution?
What I believe that one reasonable solution is you can get people to stand up and say, listen to Joel and Mudge and Marcus and Bruce Schneier, and they all tell you that authentication in this thing is badly broken. Now stop using it until the vendor fixes it, okay? And then you have to do your part and go to Microsoft and say, come on, fix Windows authentication already.
I think that is that's a bad answer to a large organization that's trying to manage risk. They need the information to make the decisions themselves. They need the tools to be able to look for vulnerabilities themselves. And I'm looking for the solution that you have as to how to give information and tools, make them available to people where the good guys can get them, the bad guys can't. If the only way is to say the information isn't there and the tools aren't there, the good guys can't protect themselves.
Yep. And my solution is the exact, is diametrically opposed to Marcus's, which is, you give that information out. You just try and slant its use, but you give them as much information as possible. And it's in the presentation of that hopefully you get more people using it for good than for bad. A hammer is a wonderfully malicious tool, can break things beautifully, but it's not presented as such. And you give it to Jimmy Carter, and he's not going to go around bashing people over the head. He's going to build a house. But you give it to, a little script kiddie, and I guarantee, actually, this might be an interesting little test. If you gave, hammers to, all the script kiddies out in the world, I bet the majority of them would actually, put nails through boards and stuff like that, just because that a hammer doesn't have that negative connotation. It was presented as a, useful tool. Now, if you give a gun to a whole bunch of people, I bet they're probably going to run around shooting people, because it's presented with a negative connotation. It's in how you initially release that information, but you still have to get all that information out there for people to do the correct risk management.
This just gave me a great idea for a social experiment, which we're not going to do, and we're going to take this question, which would be at a gathering like this, to issue everyone as they come in the door a loaded paintball gun. And the idea is that we all have to get along without anyone getting paintballed for the entire 2 hours.
I work for a large national DSL ISP, and earlier you'd said that you felt that ISPs, especially DSL ISPs, have a moral responsibility to communicate the vulnerability to the users when we're interconnecting them to the network. Now, the analogy, I don't see a parallel in the normal non-internet environment on which to base that moral assumption. At one time in our country, we were building a highway system that interconnected rural communities that had very little to no crime whatsoever. And when we put in roads to these towns, I'm a roadway vendor. Is it my responsibility to go to each and every house and say, well, look, you have to put in locks in your doors, you have to close them, you have to put in windows?
That's a really good reasoning. That's really good reasoning, and I can't address that one. I would say it's more along the line that, again, you're providing somebody an avenue. I don't know if you've got a moral responsibility when you bring cable TV in, for example, to sit your kids down and say, or somebody, it's not a better one that would have hurt me even more, would have been my argument even more, would have been to say, does the cable TV provider have a responsibility to sit your kids down and say, look, there could be some sick crap on this TV, you don't want to watch it? I don't know. That was my opinion, though, is if you're selling somebody something that has a dangerous component, I think it's a good thing to let them know about that.
Do you realistically think that
How do you define dangerous?
Well, Do you realistically think that the general user community as a whole don't know that there's security vulnerabilities in their PC software?
Yes, I really do. Yes, I really do.
I really think that everybody has, that they don't feel all these press stories, all this, that isn't sufficient notification?
It is mind-boggling. I work with a lot of financial types. Some of these guys are, very wealthy, high net worth individuals in their 60s and 70s. They don't get it. They don't realize that their secretaries that have a DSL machine that's nailed up 24 hours to the internet has got all of the information about their accounts on that machine, and they're infected with back orifice. And we tell them, hey, by the way, that's what our company does for a living.
Well,
it's really depressing.
Marcus, I'd like to bring one thing up just to let people think about this, because it's kind of interesting. All the media, all the press for the really inane like web defacements and other standard the publicity hacks that have happened. Has actually brought it to the level of attention where I can walk in to a CEO of a large organization who 2 years ago wouldn't have had any clue about computer security or hacking or anything, and the person at least knows that this is a concern and is willing to say, like, okay, how do we approach this? I am aware of it. I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is one of the results from what has happened, and it has raised the level of awareness at a position in corporations that make decisions that it didn't have this before.
But if nobody was doing it, they wouldn't have to spend money on it, it wouldn't be an issue. There is that.
If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, did it fall?
If a hacker exploits a box in Latvia that nobody's looking at, did he really take it over?
All right, gentleman in the back here.
This whole discussion repeats and repeats all the time, and it comes up. About 11 years ago, I had this same sort of conversation with a government, actually military CERT organization. We looked at a couple vulnerabilities and we said, hey, should we tell somebody? We told the vendor turned around, actually didn't do anything until three years later, 2 versions later, when it actually came out and it became in the wild. We found with everybody in here that if you look at the vulnerabilities that are found today, you're looking at 10 to 12 a week. Now, the process that you're talking about, I think everybody agrees that there's a process that has to be there. But we all know that the biggest key that we have in making any of this work is the fact that we don't have resources and we don't have the ability to make the education. Now, my solution to this, which sort of has started to come about, is the whole insurance piece. We know that corporate America, they assess the risk, and in many of the companies that I've consulted for, they go out and buy insurance. Well, then what happens when they get hacked? Well, then they have the resources because the insurance company now doesn't want to take the loss, so they go and they hire a whole bunch of security folks, and they will actually have the resources focused to make the difference. That way, you can go out and say, okay, I found this vulnerability. Well, okay, we have to have process that says, yeah, who can put it out? How quickly could we put it out? What is the ethical? Well, we know half the world isn't ethical. So as far as who can disclose it, you're never going to stop somebody from disclosing something.
I don't want to stop people from disclosing things. I simply want the righteous fury to descend upon them shortly after they do,
right.
if innocent people are victimized as a result.
Right, exactly. And the key to that is the fact that you've had the victimization so that the insurance is there. They don't want to suffer the loss. You trigger the event that gets the resources to attack the problem. Right now in the security industry, we don't have the resources to attack the problem. You stated yourself, the FBI is overworked.
The inevitable next progression from that, if the insurance guys get involved, is they will realize, see, one of the problems right now in doing civil litigation against people who are releasing exploits is not only do they not have the means, but individual organizations don't have the means. If somebody exploits my stuff, if someone exploits me, right, I'm not going to spend my hard-earned money to go sue the person who wrote the exploit. But one of the issues in a civil suit is you've got to show that you were materially damaged. If I'm an insurance company and I am paying out millions of dollars of damages claims because of some tool that somebody wrote and released, now I can point and say, we're going to obliterate this guy because he has caused us major downstream losses.
One of the things that you brought up was kind of interesting, which is the metered dissemination of information and the modified dissemination of information, for instance, in that CERT or that military-style CERT. Now, one of the things I think I'm hearing Marcus say is that, yes, you do give out some information, but you don't give out all of it. You know, you kind of hold it back, and you try and do, you know, a best judgment. Well, you have to realize that when you start doing this, you introduce an entirely new threat model again. Let me give you a zero-day exploit right here, right now. Works wonderfully. This kind of goes to your point of, hey, if you don't like exploit the problem, you don't fix it, nobody's, you know, doing anything, it doesn't cost you anything. Well, of course people are exploiting it, and it's costing you a lot of stuff. CERT. Go back through CERT's archives. CERT was very good about, you know, metering and modifying and tailoring their information release. And they had an unwritten policy. This unwritten policy was that if a vendor either could not or would not come up with a fix, they would drop their name from the list when they came out with the solutions. So you can go back and you can do a CERT dissemination traffic analysis and say, okay, this LPR bug, everybody here that was had the problem was based on a BSD derivative. And CERT always deals with X companies. At the time, they were dealing with Apollo, with Harris, with Sun, with SGI, stuff like that. And you go through, and it's all of a sudden on the announcement of, here are the fixes, Harris doesn't sit there. Well, guess what? Harris is vulnerable, always will be vulnerable. And CERT just made it publicly known that's the target you go after if you want to break into something. So when you start tailoring and start presupposing that you understand everybody else's environment, and that's what you're ultimately doing when you're modifying the data yourself. You're saying, I know what everybody's environment is, and it fits this one particular model, and that's how I'm going to release it. And that's not the way it works. That's why we have a public market with multiple people selling multiple, you know, similar products. You know, you introduced this new threat model, so it's something to think about.
Okay, I fully agree with that. We've gotten away from responsibility both from the user, from the supplier, but I get real worried at the restraining of any of this information. I've got a medium-sized company. I use Loftcrack, I use Nmap, I use every exploit. It's part of my job to go out there and find what the hackers are using and try them against my network, fix my problems. I can wait for Microsoft, or I can fix them myself. If we start controlling the information, there's going to be people making decisions on whether I should know it or not, and whether I'm allowed to defend my network. I don't want to live there.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I've got a concern, and I agree with what you say, and I think that's wonderful, but we're going out and we're using the attack tools. We're going and getting them, and the problem is we're not learning from them. We're not sitting there and saying, you know, this is the main reason that I, you know, and my organization publish the information. It's, sure, we'll give you some fish, but we're trying to give you a rod and tackle also and show you how to do this sort of thing. If you go in and say, this is how, you know, XYZ works, you know, I'll use iPivot as an example because there are other crypto accelerator boxes. We released the advisory on how we did the analysis on it, and we released the tools on how to protect yourself and the tools on how to test whether you actually have the problem. And somebody instantly always comes back and sends in saying, have you looked at this other one? It's like, well, that other one has the exact same functionality as this product. Why don't you take, we documented everything we did, even in the tools. The tools are open source. How about you use those tools and that methodology now to look for it and then help spread that information, whether this is a good one or a bad one. And I think that's the next step that people aren't able to make. And I think if we help people make that, you're going to see a lot of this concern over the malicious script kiddie tools go away.
Well, my answer to you is one, you're one of the proverbial clueful users, right? There's not a whole lot of you out there. You're a very small evolutionary niche in the networking world. Most people don't care. They don't want to know. And for them, it's sufficient to say, listen, you don't need this tool that does IP spoofing so you can check and make sure your firewall correctly blocks it. You should have a system that doesn't allow traffic in that claims to come in from the outside that claims to come from the inside. That's just obvious engineering. There are lots and lots of cases where you can look at an exploit or an exploit tool and say, you know, this is a problem problem that can be addressed through application of obvious engineering. Some of us have been talking about the don't let stuff in from the outside, or from the inside, don't let stuff in from the inside since 1986 or something crazy like that. Yet there's still spoofing problems. Releasing the tools isn't going to help. And you don't need to test that stuff if you understand that you've blocked an entire category of flaws with one fell swoop. That's what I want to be able to tell you.
But not releasing the tools, because you didn't release the tools for a long time, didn't help either.
That's...
Yeah.
You have to test it yourself.
So this is the kind of gentleman that buys a motorcycle helmet and rides himself into a tree to see if his helmet works right.
No, but you can use a crash test dummy to do that.
Yeah, use crash test dummies to do that. But see, people that you trust use the crash test dummies to make sure that that helmet is good. I don't know anyone who goes out and buys a bulletproof jacket and then goes and puts a round in their chest to see if it's any good. Okay? You do that on gelatin molds. Let's go.
Right. Right.
How hard is this? Is that they have tested, they know that it works. And when a patch comes out, they don't want to put the patch on the image because they have a known quantity of that. They've tested it, and it takes 8 months to get the new image out.
This is a big one. Operational networks where you can't make changes, those just shouldn't be connected to public networks, period.
I just want to reinforce this. I mean, this blameless user or blameless corporation argument just doesn't work. I mean, I know that the cost of Intel machines is very high. It's very difficult to put up a test system and know what's in your environment and understand how these things work, but I think we're just going to have to bear it.
One of the things that I think isn't addressed in the let's kind of start hiding information thing that full disclosure does give is it gives people who are willing to take the time to track and monitor and patch and upgrade a line of defense that they wouldn't have if they don't get all the information.
That's a very good point.
The observation is that if you're able to track and monitor all this stuff, you've got a line of defense that you would if you wouldn't have if you weren't able to monitor that information.
And further, that there are some people who do take advantage of this to actually do the patches. And this goes, and I agree with you. And if you take that away from you, you're doing a disservice.
All those people would lose
a very valuable resource.
The folks who monitor bug track but don't exploit systems would be almost as well served, if not exactly as well served, if they were simply told, there's a problem with this thing, here's a patch you need to download.
Entirely disagree.
They want to know. They want to know.
What about fragmented packets? Okay, if you say there's a problem with Microsoft's TCP stack, and you don't say it's fragmented packets, and that problem happens to exist in everybody else's stack too, you'll never know. You won't know what's built in the file.
I mean, you know, let's distinguish between exploit code and proof of concept code, and I think somebody tried to do that earlier, and that's important. And I think that clearly proof of concept is valuable for people to verify this in their own environment, to find additional ramifications in other products or other systems that they're running, and to understand just the general attack methodology to defend against future attacks or variations based on the same thing, which inevitably come up. The antivirus people have been doing it for years.
The one that's always scared me is the denial of clue attack, which is really the big counter argument to my whole position, which nobody has made yet. Right? One thing you could do would be, if I find a flaw in this piece of software, is I could write a test that verifies if the flaw is there and notifies you if the flaw is there. Right? Well, then the bad guy could simply write a test that says, you know, there's a flaw, you need to upgrade, and in fact there is no flaw. So the only downside I believe with my position of restricting the amount of information that's given out is that you are then vulnerable to somebody saying there's a flaw. I'm going to just say this so that I can depress Microsoft stock a half a point in trade on that today. All right.
Marcus, the part about Marcus, an inside joke. The part about you can just tell somebody that there is a problem is good enough. Here's my counter to that. Your house, your locks aren't good enough. You have to go replace them. Yes. So now you've gone and replaced them and you fixed your house, but you don't know why they weren't good enough, and you don't know the environments. Maybe you have similar things over at your work. you didn't learn anything other than doing a tactical point fix. And that did not help you or the environment that you're working on. And it definitely didn't help me selling, the locks or whatever the problem was. You still don't know what the problem was.
No, well, see, that's the problem, okay? You aren't giving quite enough information there. What you could say is that particular model of Schlager lock that you've got is not good. You need to replace it. Or
CERT gives enough information.
CERT does not give enough information. But I think it's okay to say, that particular model of lock isn't any good. Or perhaps combination locks are fundamentally flawed. Don't buy those. Right? You can give some information there. Now, I might say, whoa, that's serious news. And if I'm a clueful person, I'll come back and say, look, I was proposing to put this particular model of Medico lock in. Is that okay? And you'll say, to my knowledge, yes, it is.
Bring the lawyers and the people who make combination locks into the picture, and you come up with a mess that you'll never get out of.
Well, you bring lawyers into anything, and you get a mess that you can never get out of.
Why are you advocating using civil litigation?
Because I think it's going to happen anyway. It's inevitable. There's a big
Tobacco,
rock rolling down on you guys.
Look out, software.
Guns, tobacco, software. If they could figure out a way to quantify fun, that would be next on the list.
Well, everybody also realizes right now that the software that you're running is exempt from the Common Code statutes.
That's right. Yeah,
so
be very careful.
And a lot of us forget this. You don't have any ramifications or recourse whatsoever. If you have, and I always use the analogy, you set up an e-commerce site and you're running your billions of dollars and it's based on like a Microsoft, told you that they were using encryption, and it turned out that it was, like a simple XOR or something, and they didn't do any, or it just wasn't. It was planned for the next rev, and you lose all that money. Normally, if I could go to Ford, and, the Pinto really does explode, and I can say, you're liable. I had a reasonable assumption that you would adhere to the Common Code statutes. Microsoft actually does better than a lot of other companies in this, which is they'll give you $50 of the cost of the software back, whichever is less.
Right.
But that's better than nothing. They're all exempt from the Common Code statutes, and the large companies are scared to get involved in this because they see liabilities being imposed upon themselves as soon as they do this. And this is a problem why we're having this big discussion of will you have civil litigation involved or not, because there's no liability on this one side based on the current laws, and you have to get those changed. And you have big guns, big money, big lawyers fighting against that.
And the big vendors have realized that that's going to be a roadblock ahead of them, and have been trying to circumvent it with legislation that essentially lets them off the hook for anything that ever goes wrong with their software ever.
Just real quick too, anybody that thinks that lawyers and legislation is going to be a rational process, look at tobacco. The Surgeon General has determined that this is dangerous for you. 25 years that was on the package. I mean, and they're still being sued. So this common statute, rationality goes right out the window. Well, why aren't you?
Let's not go into the tobacco rabbit hole.
Looking at that analogy with the testing of automobiles and a third party that we trust to do that, I think with the software situation, there's a much bigger scaling problem. There's so much software out there to test. There are so many potential problems. With apologies to the ICSA person that I know is sitting up there toward the front, you look at the ICSA certifications, and what are they telling you? They are telling you that software meets a certain list of criteria. They're not telling you that it's secure or that it is absolutely impervious to problems, and really having that information out there in the community where there are a lot of people who are willing to take it and do that testing. Admittedly, not all of them are that trusted third party. Some of them we can't trust, but there are so many people who are willing to volunteer their time.
The whole issue of finding a trusted third party is going to be a tricky one, and we're also now moving into an environment where vendors will have their employees sandbag each other's products by looking for flaws in them that they can then publish anonymously under different names.
The software certification and the security thing is also, and this is not meant as a pot shot on like the ICSA or those different certification tracks. I think it's fundamentally flawed in what they're doing. The type of certification that they're looking for in like, how does this firewall do X, Y, Z? Well, they're looking at what it's saying, do the doors open? Check, yes. Does it have tires? Check. Yes. That's not telling me about the security. It's not saying, are the hinges, is this going to show wear if I start slamming it in this particular direction? Is this going to show, that at certain speeds the tires aren't balanced correctly? They're not doing that in depth, and they really can't, because that's a scalability problem right there. But going along and saying, yes, we have this underwriter's laboratory for Cyber UL, which John Tan over the Loft at Stake wrote, wrote an underwriter's laboratory paper, explaining like the corollaries and how it might work, how it might not. Becomes very difficult. The current ones we have, you need to be aware of, because I'm concerned that they give you a false sense of security.
We've got, the car analogy is a really good one. I live in the state of Maryland, which has some really interesting things. When you register a vehicle in the state of Maryland, they walk down a whole checklist and make sure it's got seat belts and blah, 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 and all the stuff that it's supposed to have, and then they never check it again, which is fundamentally stupid. What Maryland is saying is if a vehicle is safe to drive once, it's safe to drive forever. Other states like Virginia, you have an annual safety inspection where they make sure that things have actually gotten fixed. And of course, lots of people hate that process. What we need for security maybe is, is for the great hand to sweep down and say, okay, all of you are still running Windows for Work groups. Take it off. You can't do that anymore.
There's really a lot of interesting points brought up, and I guess my mind keeps racing back and forth, and I change what I was going to say as each person says something. But primarily, there is the real issue here is full disclosure, and I think that you can send out enough information to let people know what the exposure is, what the likelihood of the risk is, without actually giving them source code that's going to allow them to do damage. The gentleman behind me here was talking about evaluating the risk, and he seemed to be saying that you needed to know all the information to evaluate the risk, and I don't think that's true.
I said, how do you determine who?
Yeah, and I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying that there's a certain level of information that you need, and you do not need it all. And I guess as an example of full disclosure, I sort of would like to humbly issue a challenge to Mudge, and that's if you're going to be releasing a new version of Loftcrack, why is it that you could not release it without actually displaying the passwords that it cracks, just saying whether or not they're cracked, in which case you can then, an administrator can effectively determine whether or not the people are following their password policy without actually knowing what the password is. If they have administrative access, they can change the password if they need to find out what it is.
There's a checkbox for that now.
But why have it? Why even make it a checkbox? Why not just issue it such that it's impossible to actually crack the whole password?
Because this is very easy to answer, because I broke into all of your systems the other night, and I'm not going to tell you how to do it, so go fix them. You didn't learn anything from that, and you don't know whether I'm telling you bullshit or whether I'm telling you the truth.
That's the denial of clue attack.
Yep.
To which, the way you deal with the denial of clue attack is take you out in the parking lot, beat the information out of you, which is basically what I believe is going to wind up happening down the road. Is you're going to be held in contempt until you tell us what it was.
The full disclosure, the information will come out at some point.
Right.
It will, whether you did it or not. So, if it comes out and you're not in. I come out with an exploit or I come out with an advisory, and I give a watered-down partial description of it. Somebody else is going to come out with the data points that I did not actually touch upon. I can't control how those are released. I can't control the slant. I can't control the spin on that because I'm not the one doing the releasing. By releasing it all myself, I am at least controlling the slant and spin on stuff that I wouldn't necessarily have control over. I can gear that more towards a beneficial use.
The corollary of that is it's pointless to have it Loftcrack no longer display the passwords, because now that they've taught everyone how to do it, the cat's out of the bag.
Well, here's the better one. I'll just tell you that all the passwords are broken. I don't understand why people haven't clued on. Loftcrack gets all of the passwords because you can go through the key space.
Right.
It's like, so they're saying which ones, what it's doing is it's telling you which ones are stronger than other ones based upon the amount of time, based upon the particular direction only Loftcrack is going. So it doesn't mean that somebody else wouldn't start at trying to go for the heavy end 14-character ones first and go, or the 7 and 7s as the case breaks down and backwards. It's just going to tell you, it was a proof of concept. Look, Microsoft passwords are not stored correctly, and what do you learn from that? You can learn, I'll make my users change their passwords. Well, you probably didn't learn what we were really originally intending for you to learn. We were originally intending to show this is why you keep your Microsoft network inside a particular perimeter, and you don't allow people to do port 137, 139 across this boundary.
Years ago. Well, the really interesting piece is the really interesting piece is why in the hell did Microsoft fix it? Actually, we are pretty much out of time. What I'd like to do is conclude this session at this point. It's been an interesting discussion. I've taken some lumps. I hope I've given a few.
Do we have one?
Thanks for coming.